Today, we are going to talk about how we can handle user settings in SharePoint Framework the right way. I'm Paolo, I'm a senior developer advocate in Microsoft, and now let's move to the actual content of this demo. And let me try to set a bit of context. So why should we care about storing user settings in SharePoint Framework? Well, because every now and then we have web parts or extensions which need to store some information, some options or preferences of our users. And we want to do that in a smart way so that we can have settings stored on a per user basis, relying on the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, if possible, and maybe across multiple devices, and potentially also with the capability to reuse the same settings or options or preferences across multiple web parts, which can be part of the same solution, or across multiple applications within the same solution. Why not? And why would you do that? Well, because you want to have something more than what is available, what is provided out of the box by SharePoint Framework or by the regular web and client-side technologies, like, for example, storing local user settings or stuff like that. For example, if you rely on local user settings, those settings will be just local in the browser session where the user is. If you want to have those settings available across multiple applications, relying on the ecosystem provided by Microsoft 365 will give you a better result, as you will pretty soon see in this demo. Moreover, if you have a custom solution to properly handle user settings in your SharePoint Framework development, you can also be resilient to technology changes. And what I mean is that, for example, if something will change in the way we can store information on the client side or through SharePoint Framework, well, using your own infrastructure, your own solution built the right way, you can be independent from those technology changes. And as I said, you can also have a solution which is much more enterprise ready and ready to support multiple devices and components. And last but not least, security is always fundamental. The solution I'm going to show you now is a solution which is really secure and allows every single user to have her or his own settings without any risk of having settings or information of a user available to any other user in the system. So let's move to the proposed solution, which is based on a SharePoint Framework web part, which relies on a backend REST API service, which has been built using an Azure function, creating an Azure function, secured with Entra ID and open authorization. So when it comes to security, we rely on the best options we have in the fields of SharePoint Framework custom development, so Entra ID and open authorization. We also rely in this solution on the Microsoft Graph to get access to a special folder that every user does have for every application registered in Entra ID, and I will show you what I mean with special folder. And then we store the settings in this scenario, in this sample, as a JSON file in that special folder. But you can do actually whatever you want. Can be one file, can be multiple files, can be whatever you need to store in order to keep track of the user preferences. And what is really important is that we rely on the OneDrive for Business service instance for every single user, so that, as I said before, we can have a dedicated storage for these settings and preferences on a per user basis. And all of that thanks to Entra ID. So let me briefly show you a solution diagram to let you better understand what I'm talking about. And then I will switch to the actual demo environment and show you how it works and how I built it. So let's imagine that we have a user, and the user is willing to interact with the SharePoint Framework web part, or generally speaking, also with a more generic Microsoft 365 solution, and makes a request through a browser to get access to a SharePoint Framework web part. Well, in this solution, first of all, through the SharePoint Framework out-of-the-box capabilities, we rely on Entra ID to request an access token for the current user to consume an external API that we host as an Azure function. Then we invoke the API providing the access token. The API itself, so I mean the Azure function, will still rely on Entra ID to get what is called a NOBO on behalf of token, so that by requesting and getting back a NOBO token from Entra ID, the Azure Function REST API will be able to consume Microsoft Graph on behalf of the user who is consuming the SharePoint Framework web part in the front end. And by doing that, through Microsoft Graph, the Azure Function will get access to one or more files stored in this special folder that I'm talking about, and will be able to retrieve the content of the file and make it available to the Azure Function, so that the Azure Function will be able to provide the settings and the information to the SharePoint Framework web part, which will be able to render the content personalized based on the preferences of the user. So that's the big picture of the solution I'm going to show you and to share with you right now. So now let's switch to the actual demo, and let's see how it has been implemented and how it works. So let me switch to my browser. And first of all, this is the page where you can find additional information about the sample solution that I'm sharing with you now. And it's available on the sample gallery. And you can find it also on GitHub. There is a GitHub repository, which is the SPFx web parts, where you can find this web part, including a nice looking, or supposed to be nice looking, README file, and also with a technical overview of the solution itself, thanks to GitHub Copilot indeed. So this is the sample solution that you are going to see. And now let's see the solution in action. First of all, I said we rely on a special folder, where a special folder is nothing more than something that you can get through a Microsoft Graph, so that you can make a graph request for this specific endpoint, /me/drive/special, and the name of the special folder you're looking for. Notice that here we have /me. So it is an endpoint on a per user basis. So every single user will get a different endpoint for a specific special folder. Now, when it comes to requesting a special folder, here is the list of special folders that you can request, including this one, the uproot one. So if you make a request for /me/drive/special/uproot, what will happen will be that Microsoft Graph will give you back an endpoint to access the information to access still through Microsoft Graph, a folder in the OneDrive for Business of the current user, because of this me, and this special folder will be actually a folder under the apps subfolder in the OneDrive for Business of the user, which is connected to the application, Entra ID application, that you are going to use to make a request for that specific approval. Meaning that every single and every different application registered in Entra ID will have a different application route for every single user in the OneDrive of the user. Okay, so that's why you can have a fully isolated set of settings on a per app and per user basis. Now, let me first of all show you the web part in action, and then we will dig into the actual functionality under the cover. This is the web part. Clearly, it is a web part just to let you take inspiration from this pattern. So I'm not willing to show you a really nice looking web part. This is just based on the out-of-the-box layout of the pre-scaffolded web parts in SharePoint Framework. But I have this section where I can create personal settings made of a key and of a value. So, for example, my setting that I want to add could be community rocks. Okay? So, by adding this setting in my personal settings, I will be able to store this information in the personal folder of the uproot of this application, and I will get back a list. Of course, the process was sleeping and now it is running. You can see here I have my new key and my new value available. I can even edit it and remove any setting if I want to get rid of it. What happens under the cover is that in the OneDrive for Business of my user, in the apps folder, in the application folder dedicated to the application that I'm using right now and that I'm going to show you soon, I have a JSON file where I'm storing all of the settings, including the key 1, key 2, my settings with community rocks. So this is just an idea. And as I said, here you can store all of the settings in a single file, or if you need or if you like, you can even store multiple files which will be related only to this specific application and to this specific user. In order to being able to do that, I need, first of all, to have an application registered in Entra ID, which is what I have. As you can see right here, this is my application, React settings approved. And as you can notice, the name, the display name of this application is precisely the name of the folder that I've got and that I have in the OneDrive for Business of my user. This application, if we look into the settings, is configured from an API permission point of view to consume Microsoft Graph with the files.readwrite.app folder delegated permission. Why? Because that's the permission we need as per the documentation that we have in Microsoft Graph. Then we also expose an API with this application, and this will be the API that we are going to consume from the SharePoint Framework web part. So we have a permission scope which is called usersettings.manage, and this permission scope is the one that SharePoint Framework relies on to get the access token to consume my custom API. Plus, in the certificates and secrets, I've configured the client secret so that I can use it in order to retrieve the on behalf of token for my user. Then I have the SharePoint Framework solution itself. So let me show you that one. Here is the solution that you can find on GitHub, as I said, and that's divided into two main sections, the backend and the frontend. In the backend, we have the Azure function, which is a TypeScript Azure function, while in the front end, we have the SharePoint Framework web part. And let's start from that one. In the SharePoint Framework web part, this is a really simple and regular web part, as I said before, but in the render method of my web part, using the out-of-the-box capabilities of SharePoint Framework, I use the AD HTTP client factory of the context to get a client, an HTTP client, to consume the unique URI of an application. What is this application? Well, clearly is the application that I just showed you in Entra ID. And in fact, if we go to expose an API, that application does have a unique URI, and this will be the value that I need to provide as a settings for my web part to get an HTTP client. Then I provide the HTTP client to the React component that I use for rendering the UI of my web part. And in there, I have a functional component that I decided to use to render my web part. And in there, I simply rely on my API so I can make the fetch of a specific item, and I can make a post to add a new setting, I can make a put to update a new setting, I can delete settings, and of course I can create a new one if I want to create a new setting. So simply by relying on the HTTP client created by SPFx based on the application unique URI of my app registered in Entra ID, I can then target my API which will be available at a specific URL. And that's why, if I switch briefly back to this page, I can show you that in edit mode, we can configure this web part to have a specific application unique URI, which is precisely the one I showed you before, and the URL. And right now, the URL of the endpoint of my API is running locally on my local machine just for the sake of showing you the API in action. And this is the URL I can use to consume my API. So basically, here in SharePoint Framework, I'm reaching out to the API, which is running locally, and then I'm managing the setting keys. When I do that, I rely on the fact that in SharePoint Framework, I can declare that I want to have a set of Web API permission requests. And specifically, I have a Web API permission request for my backend app registered in Entra ID and looking for the specific permission scope. And through this setting in the package solution JSON file of my solution, I have that again in Entra ID for my SharePoint Online client extensibility, which is the first-party application provided by Microsoft to securely access backend APIs in SharePoint Framework. I can look into the security permissions, and I can see that here somewhere I will have, most likely at the end, and here we are, I have a permission for the React setting approved to use the permission scope user settings.manage. So this is to give you the full round trip of the open authorization flow that is happening under the cover. So now we have the function, the Azure function, and in the Azure function, we have a set of plumbing code to validate the access token that we get, so the OBO token that we get from the Azure, from the SharePoint Framework consumer. And we do the validation of the token. And once we have got the proper token, we can process all of the requests of the user through this endpoint user settings, which will go through the request method. And if it is a request to create a new setting, it will make a post. If it will be a request to update one, it will be a put. If it will be a request to delete, it will be a delete one. And before relying on the actual request of the user, we validate the token. We get the OBO token so that we can interact with Graph on behalf of the user. Then we get the uproot, which means that, as I was showing you before, we make a request to Graph to get the special folder uproot, which will become the root that I have in OneDrive for Business for my specific application, just because I'm providing the access token issued to my application, and based on the fact that it is issued for my application, Microsoft Graph will give me back the right uproot folder for my current application. And once I've done with that, we go back here, I get the uproot, I can read the setting files, and again, to read the setting file, I can simply use Microsoft Graph, and I can access the drive item, and I can get the content of that drive item. Once I have the settings, I can simply play with the settings. So I can read all of them, I can add a new item, I can update, or I can delete an item. Simple as that. And then we expose as an Azure function REST API the user setting endpoint with all of these HTTP methods. So, as I said, feel free to download the source code of the solution so that you can run through it and have a better understanding of how it works. But this is a really solid and secure pattern to handle security on a per user and per app basis. And if you will share the same app behind the scenes of multiple applications or web parts, you can have preferences and settings shared across multiple web parts for the same user. Here you have some useful links, which I also provided in the chat. And I think that's all for me. So thank you, and back to you, Vesa.